I remembered hearing on my internet news feed that there were these regional fires further inland. Thought, as usual, we were to take our precautions while doing our everyday activities and living our lives. We were to try and do things to the best of our abilities, and to not let the fires intimidate us too much. At the time, I lived at a flat in a high-rise building overlooking the coast, and I could actually see a fair amount of distance inland, as the bushfire season was a yearly occurrence. But at the time, we not knew just how bad it would have been, and just how bad it was. Taking the rail into the central business district was the same as usual, crowded, rude, and late. But as the days passed, it seemed to get more and more tense. The news feed was consistently speaking about related articles and discussions and commentaries about the fires, how fast they were moving, strong they were, the flames were more ferocious than anything seen in living memory. Even while on the rail into the central business district, soon all the discussions from the commuters were about the fires. One bloke even mentioned to a mate that if it were up to him, he wouldn't even journey into the district. He'd rather be with his family, but his job was located there and he had no choice. All stories of people who were literally forced to commute into the district made the rounds through the local internet, as people were increasingly worried about their safety to and from the business district with the fires. But the government wasn't doing much to stop people from worrying, and didn't necessarily explain what was happening at all. While I was returning home from where I worked near the district, I read reports mentioning that millions of acres were burned across the interior of the country. Thousands of homes were destroyed, and even dozens of people were dead. All the while the government downplayed accounts of how severe everything was. The fires weren't endangering this particular part of the country, so no one apparently wanted to care. But the discussions on the newsfeed were mentioning that it would have been eventually a moderate time before the fires became a threat to us. I awoke one day to see a cloud-like fog in the distance from my high-rise flat. It looked eerie, it looked unreal, it even looked as if death itself was coming for us, and yet we weren't doing anything to save ourselves from it. While I was waiting on the rail to take me into the central business district, the feed had a report of the fire department and how it was so understaffed, so underfunded, and ironically so underappreciated even at a time like this. They were trying so hard to save us, to protect us. Some were not even getting any rest for days. It was constant battling against the fires. They were just out there, doing nothing but fighting the fires. And the government only increased funding temporarily for them because the entire country was demanding better treatment for them. While I was walking through the district, the smoke overcasted the entire area. While the sun was seen overhead, it was a sort of a haze because the clouds were coming in with the air currents from the interior of the country to the coast and finally out to the Tasman Sea. The news became so depressing as the days went on. One time when I was on my lunch break, I was outside a bakery for a pie and I overheard a conversation that one of the restaurant owners was going to close due to a lack of customers. They were even going to possibly relocate back to their own country because they didn't think that the government would be so inept at handling the situation with the fires. They actually believed that it was safer to go back home rather than face uncertainty here in the future. One morning I awoke in my flat to look out over the horizon and there was an orange light glow, but it was early in the morning. Normally you see an orange glow like that at sunset. From what people later said, it was a combination of the fires in the distance coming closer and the sunlight crossed it, so as a result, it was an orange glow which made everything into a bizarre landscape, an unnaturally orange landscape. As I remember walking through the district one time, and there was even ash upon the streets that was blown in on the wind from fires raging further inland. The whole setting of a cityscape, dense buildings with little to no lights on, due to people not being within them, thick ash in the streets, nothing but footsteps visible from the ashes, and finally a depressing and somber orange crusted sky. The whole setting looked like something out of an apocalyptic horror movie or novel, but there was nothing fictitious about what we were seeing. This was all real, this was all happening, and this was all in front of our eyes. I saw some people oblivious to what was happening, as they almost intentionally avoided looking up and around as they walked through the district, as if they wanted to pretend that the fires weren't real and that none of this was happening to themselves or others or even the country. One day, while I was heading back from the CBD, I was listening to a news report in the feed on my cellular phone that mentioned the Aboriginals called these fires mega fires, something that occurred only once in 1,000 years. That these fires were the wrath of the gods. These storms were all too powerful, too quickly moving, and far too destructive. Fires like these were called the Great Burning, and was the stories of legends. But there was nothing legendary about this. People whispered to each other that the government were ignoring claims about the environment for years, decades even, and now what was happening was something that we caused ourselves. The orange caustic glow continued for days, weeks even, as the situation with the fires became so dire that the government requested help from the United States and Europe, as these firefighters were brought in to help with the situation inland, and the combined force barely halted the flames. The foreign firefighters remarked in interviews that the fires seemed unnatural. The flames were too strong, too brutal. Even the most modern firefighting technology from the United States wasn't able to stop the flames for too long. Panic had begun to set in within the population, as even on the coast, the fires reached. People were huddling near the beaches at night because their homes were burnt. Anger at the government for essentially letting this happen was increasing. These sorts of headlines were consistently in the news feed, as I awoke one morning to barely be able to see the horizon out of my high-rise flat. Everything seemed to be within the orange haze. It was actually quite frightening. I couldn't see anything now, just the haze. If death was coming for us, none of us would see it until it was far too late now. The smoke from the fires was pushed by the continental currents across the ditch. The orange haze was now even seen from New Zealand, as the Kiwis were angry that our problem had become theirs. The smoke from the original flames was so powerful it did not disperse into the air currents. It had even gone across the entire Pacific Ocean to South America, being that of Chile and Argentina. Some news reports even proclaimed that this was the beginning of the end. Waiting for the rail, I even saw soot from the flames blown all the way out to where I lived. Stepping on it to the track, I had to cover my face to avoid breathing in the ash as I rode the rail into the CBD once more. Walking through it, none of it was vibrant, none of it was happy or lively. It was nothing but the depressing hellscape that had come to be there and was there to remind us that there were no other choices but to keep on coming in and out of the district. Those who could now avoid it already have. I then awoke one day in my flat to see that the smoke had finally disappeared. The fires were put out, and the government was eager for the population to quickly forget what had happened. Nearly a year of dealing with the Black Summer, as it was now called. Millions of acres were destroyed. Some were saying that perhaps more than a quarter of all the land surface in the country was destroyed, that it could theoretically take centuries for the land to recover on its own. All in all, more than 1 billion animals across the country were dead, consumed and burned to death by the flames. Some species were even extinct due to entire populations being consumed in the fires. Habitats were destroyed as well. Migration patterns forever changed as a result of the flames. Our country was portrayed negatively for the entire world to see, as there were criticisms from national governments as well as communal populations, all commenting on how our environment was to ordinary citizens, as they were hesitant to even visit the nation as tourists. Quietly, the government admitted that for a time the tourism industry would suffer billions of dollars due to the lack of visitors to the country. The pristine and beautiful image of our country was forever lost. The government, of course, would ignore all of what had happened, and made safeguards for themselves in the future to protect the upper tiers of the echelon of the government that governed the nation. But for ordinary people, there were no real guarantees that any of us were safe. As I stood in my high-rise flat one morning, the view was so beautiful, the view was so pristine. You could see endless amounts of beauty from the coast or even further inland. But then I remembered what had happened, and all of what I had learned. Most people had forgotten what had occurred. We all have short-term memory. But the scientists, both nationally and internationally, said that the fires in the future would be even stronger than what we had experienced in the Black Summer. And if that's indeed true, is there anything we can possibly do? Or are we all going to be consumed by the flames that so many now believe us to be? The end is coming, and this time we won't be able to stop it.